Many of you know this, that I spent some time before becoming a parish priest serving as a hospital chaplain. Spent a number of years working as a hospital chaplain in Utah and serving a couple of different hospitals there. And I'm going to give you a little insider information about the hospital world. George Clooney steered us in the wrong direction. Did you know that if you go to an emergency visit, it's not called the emergency room in the hospital world. It's called the emergency department. And if you worked in a hospital, it's the ED, not the ER. If you say the ER, then people think that you got that from watching TV, right? But the emergency department. So now you know. Now you have a little bit of background information. And next time you go to a hospital, you can say, "Oh, is the ED over that way?" And they'll know exactly what you're talking about. And they'll be proud of you for using the right terminology. One of my responsibilities, as you probably imagine, was doing rounds on all of the different floors and all of the different departments, including the ED. And I remember one time in particular, I was doing some rounds in the ED, and there was a woman who was in her room, and she was handcuffed to her bed. And there was a prison guard outside her room on a chair, and she was wearing an orange jumpsuit that was left open, and so her body was exposed. I went in to her room and first of all covered her with a blanket because I thought it would be a good idea to maybe protect her dignity a little bit. And when I went in her room, I noticed that her eyes were swollen shut and her cheeks were puffy and bruised. She had had some injuries on her face, and she was slowly weeping. Tears were slowly coming down her cheeks. And she couldn't talk very much. She was in a lot of pain. And she had wounds on her knuckles and her hands. And she had been in a prison brawl. As you imagine, it was a prisoner. It was an inmate. That's why there was a prison guard. That's why she was handcuffed to the bed. She couldn't move because she was handcuffed to the bed, and her legs were leg ironed to the bed. And she continued to just lay on the bed and weep. And I asked her if there was anything on her heart that maybe she might want to talk about. And she thanked me, first of all, for covering her up. She wasn't able to do that for herself. And then she told me that she was just weighed down with so much regret. She tried to open her eyes to see me, but she really was in too much pain to be able to do that. And so she didn't even know who I was or what I looked like. All she knew is that I had told her that I was a chaplain. And she told me that she had regretted a lot of the things that she had done in her life. She had regretted the crime that brought her to prison. And she had regretted some decisions that she had made in her life that led her to the point where she committed that crime. She regretted things that she had done while imprisoned, including the fight that she had been in. And she was just in what she called this vicious cycle of regret and pain and grief. And after we talked for a while, she reached a point where she was just in too much pain to keep talking. And I asked her if she would like me to just stay there with her for a while in silence. And would it be comforting if I held your hand? And she nodded. She said, "Yeah, that would be nice." And so I reached over the bed rail and just stood there with her while I held her hand as her wrist was still handcuffed to the bed frame. And it's important for us to remember that this woman was so much more than just a prisoner. She was someone's daughter. She may have been someone's mother. Probably was someone's sister. Definitely someone's friend. She's so much more than a criminal or a convicted felon, or even a victim or a perpetrator of a prison fight. This woman is a human, and she deserved to be treated with dignity, even though it didn't really seem like the prison officer sitting outside, or maybe even the medical care team at the time seemed to pay much heed to her dignity being honored. And you might say that this woman was tormented. She was tormented by that pain, grief, and that sadness. And you might even say, metaphorically, that she was wrestling with some demons, praying, hoping, wishing to exorcise those demons. In our gospel passage today, Jesus talks to someone that we're told has an unclean spirit. And it's important that we ask ourselves the question, what does that mean? Now, we know that when we read the scriptures, we want to read them in context. And so if we think about the context of the time and the place where these scriptures were taking place, then we can infer that the term unclean spirit was probably used as a catch-all. When something was wrong with someone, that person had an unclean spirit. And if we think about the medical knowledge that we have now compared to the medical knowledge that we had 2,000 years ago, well, we know that germ theory isn't really that old. So we didn't even know that there were such a thing as viruses and bacteria. And it's even been more recent that we've been able to see those life forms, if you will, with electron microscopes. So it was just a theory for a while, and then now eventually we can see and study viruses and bacteria. But years ago, if someone became ill, we didn't have an explanation for that. And so that could have been an unclean spirit. Now we know today, because we can study viruses, that when we are sick and we have a virus, we can easily pass that virus to somebody else if we don't take precautions. And we know that it's a good idea to wash our hands and to wear masks if we're sick and to avoid other people if we can. But back in those days, they didn't know about germs, and they didn't know about viruses, and they didn't know that viruses could be spread. But they did know that if you spent time with somebody with an unclean spirit, there was a chance you also could get an unclean spirit. So people were not only shunned for having that unclean spirit, they were also shunned for visiting with people who had an unclean spirit, because you could catch it too, right? So now we know how to take precautions about that, and we know that it's not literally an unclean spirit. But we can kind of get the idea of what may have been going on in this conversation. And we can ask ourselves questions like, have we ever been maybe in a fight, like this woman who I visited in the hospital? Have you been in a car accident of some kind? Or have you had maybe a fall? Have you tripped and fallen and injured yourself? Or have you been in a motorcycle accident? And if you have, then there's a good chance that any physical injuries you accrued in these incidents probably healed. Maybe even relatively quickly. Right? But what about the emotional piece of that? Maybe if you have been in a car accident, maybe you're hesitant whenever you get in a car anymore. Or maybe you don't like going back to the place where that fight occurred. Or maybe you're just not ready to get back on that bike. The unclean spirit in this case is the memory of that injury. And it lives on a lot longer than the physical woundedness can be visible. Now, this doesn't mean, by the way, that emotional piece can't be overcome. But it does mean that we can't always see people's unclean spirits that might be tormenting them. Simply because someone doesn't show that they have any physical ailments, it doesn't mean that they don't have any emotional pain and suffering. Now, maybe this woman in the hospital had some unclean spirits of her own in the past. And maybe she still had them. But I think if we think about it, and if we're honest with ourselves, don't we all have some unclean spirits? You know, there are a lot of times in my life that I wish things had gone differently. There are things that I've done that I wish I hadn't have done, or maybe things that I've said that I wish I hadn't have said. There are things that happened years ago that I'm still embarrassed by, even though they happened so long ago. Now, if I'm honest with myself, I might even be the only person who remembers these traumatic experiences, but it doesn't mean that they don't torment me. Do you have some of those unclean spirits that you're wrestling with? I'm guessing there's a good chance that you probably have a few here or there. And when we notice our unclean spirits rearing their ugly heads, it's okay to reflect on them. And it's even okay to weep, as the woman did in that hospital bed that day. But at a certain point, we can get some comfort from our unclean spirits, and maybe even some relief. Because what did Jesus do with that unclean spirit in that story that we just shared? He shushed it. He told that unclean spirit, shut up. He told the spirit to stop tormenting the man. And him, by the way, and Jesus, by the way. And the spirit listened. So it's important for us to ask ourselves, if Jesus shushes our unclean spirits, are they willing to listen to him? And I know it isn't always easy, and in fact, I'm pretty bad at it. But if I take some time and remind myself who is in charge, then maybe I can be a little more trusting in Jesus. The sad thing is, our unclean spirits can have a tendency to make us question our own self-worth or even our own inherent goodness. And society doesn't always do a very good job of making things any better. Why, for instance, did this woman have to be stripped down while she was handcuffed to a bed, unable even to cover her own body? Why was she just there, exposed, visible for everybody who passed by to gawk at? I don't believe that a felony conviction means that someone's dignity is simply tossed aside. And we can imagine what it might be like if each of us were known strictly by the worst thing we'd ever done in our lives. That would be, I think, a pretty intense unclean spirit. And I also hate to be the bearer of bad news, but if you haven't heard, there is a presidential election coming up this year. And have you paid attention to the political climate in our country lately? Because people don't exactly speak to each other about things that they disagree about in a civilized way. And instead of sharing ideas and trying to learn from each other, we kind of bash the people that we perceive to be others, don't we? Hear all the time things like, can you believe these idiots on the other side? Or anybody who doesn't like the candidate that I like is a moron. We say those things, don't we? When we hear them. We hear them a lot. And when voters talk unkindly about other voters, and when candidates talk unkindly about the competition, I think those pretty well sound like unclean spirits to me. But our gospel today teaches us that Jesus doesn't want us to have unclean spirits. He doesn't want us to dwell on our uncleanness. He tells that unclean spirit to stop tormenting us. Shut up, unclean spirit. You don't own me. Those unclean spirits that we hear sometimes in the back of our heads that tell us we're no good, or that maybe we don't deserve dignity, or that maybe we don't deserve love or respect, those unclean spirits can just shut right up because Jesus tells them to. And he tells them to because he loves us and not the unclean spirits. He loves the people whom the unclean spirits possess, but not the unclean spirits. That woman, that prisoner, was and still is a beloved child of God. And it doesn't matter that she committed a crime or got in a fight. Those don't take away from her humanity, and they don't take away from the love that Jesus has for her. You and I are beloved children of God. And the things we've done in our lives don't take away from that. Our unclean spirits can be silenced through love. You see, each of us is valuable in God's eyes. And I'm not more or less valuable than you are. And that imprisoned woman is not more or less valuable than anyone else. And we know our value because of the price that was paid on our behalf. God loved the world in such a way that he gave us his only Son to be one of us and to be just as human as each of us. Now, Jesus, being fully human and fully divine, probably wrestled with some unclean spirits of his own. He got sick. He was injured. Is it heretical to think that maybe Jesus did some things that maybe irritated his mom just a little bit? Well, I don't think so. Jesus was probably made fun of and teased, and he probably got into fights. We even have some of those stories in our scripture. Remember the time he turned over the tables in the temple? Or how about the time that he called a woman a dog? Jesus stepped in it a few times. But his love still conquered all. And Jesus' unclean spirits were silenced. And we can silence our own as well. Sometimes it's human nature to feel unworthy. Sometimes we don't feel like we're loved. Sometimes we feel like we're not good enough. And maybe it's because we've been in a prison fight. But maybe it's just because we've had a rough day and maybe we're feeling a little bit grumpy. But those feelings are unclean spirits. And they're unnecessary. And Jesus wants to silence them. That woman, that prison inmate who was chained to that bed, she is loved. And she is worthy of love. Those political candidates, the ones that we like and the ones that we can't stand, they're loved. And they're worthy of love. You, me, the people we love, the people we like, people we don't like, all loved and all worthy of love. So if you reach a point where your unclean spirits rear their ugly heads, remember, you're not alone. And then remember the actions of Jesus. And tell those unclean spirits to be silenced. Hey, unclean spirits, guess what? We are beloved children of God. And we have no need or use for unclean spirits to interfere with his love for us. Amen.